Russell Wilson has been a complete disaster so far for the Denver Broncos. That trade and contract are looking like a major mistake, but the Broncos' problems are a lot bigger than just Russell Wilson. Nathaniel Hackett is in his first year as a head coach, the Broncos have been just decimated by injuries, and Russell Wilson has been hurt, which has likely been hindering his play. Things are very bad in Denver, but it's a lot more complex than it seems on the surface. It's no secret that the Denver Broncos have struggled to find a stable starting quarterback since Peyton Manning retired. Paxton Lynch was a bust, and it was always clear that Trevor Siemian wasn't the guy. Then Denver threw a ton of money at Case Keenum for him to toss 15 interceptions. Drew Lock wasn't the long-term solution, and Teddy Bridgewater flopped last season. Finally, it appeared that Denver had its guy, Russell Wilson. The Broncos traded 2 first-round picks, 2 seconds, a 5th, Drew Lock, Noah Fant, and Shelby Harris, all for Russell Wilson and a 4th. Wilson then went on to sign a 5-year, $245 million extension in Denver, which means he's going to be locked up through the 2028 season at an average annual salary of $48.5 million. In other words, the Broncos need to figure out how they can make this work. There's no question that Russell Wilson has looked like a shell of his old self, and there are plenty of speculations to why that could be. A big one is injuries. Russell Wilson has a partially torn hamstring, and that's something that surely affects his mobility and pocket movement, but it doesn't necessarily explain some of his inaccuracies and struggles throwing the ball. His partially torn lat does though. Wilson has received some plasma injections in his injured shoulder this season. It's no question that Russell Wilson isn't 100%, but how much of his struggles are actually to blame on injuries? There are plenty of other problems, like the lack of chemistry with his receivers. There have been plenty of instances where his receivers are simply not on the same page or in the right spot. Drops have been a major issue. There was the big Mike Boone drop in week 4 when he dropped a wide open pass on 4th down that clinched the win for the Raiders. But it's been a team-wide issue, and that's not really that surprising. Before Wilson even got to Denver back in 2020, the Broncos had a 17.9 drop rate of catchable passes. The league average was only 15.5. PFF also has the Broncos receiving unit graded out at 62.2, which is the worst in the league. The Denver Broncos have dealt with an absurd amount of injuries this season, and it really hasn't been talked about enough. It doesn't excuse the poor execution by Russell Wilson or Nathaniel Hackett, but it's very clearly made things a lot harder. The offensive line has been the most glaring issue in my opinion, just when watching the Broncos play. Starting left tackle Garrett Bowles broke his leg and is out for the year, and right tackle Billy Turner is on injured reserve with a knee injury, plus center Lloyd Cushenberry is on injured reserve with a groin injury. From the expected preseason offensive line starters, only 2 players are currently starting, one of which, Graham Glasgow, was the projected right guard and is currently at center. Left guard Dalton is the only offensive lineman that remains at his expected position. Denver had a huge loss to injury before the year even started too. Wide receiver Tim Patrick tore his ACL. He was a top target in Denver for the previous 2 years. It hasn't helped that Wilson has been without his other 2 best wide receivers for some of the season too. Jerry Jeudy hasn't played since week 10 because of an ankle injury, and KJ Hamler hasn't seen the field since week 8 due to a hamstring injury. The offensive injuries don't end there either. The Broncos running back room has been demolished. Javonte Williams was supposed to be the top guy this year, but he ended up tearing his ACL. Behind him was Melvin Gordon, who was waived after he had a ton of fumbling issues. And Mike Boone hasn't played since week 7 because of an ankle injury. Denver has had its fair share of injuries on the defensive side of the ball too. Safety Justin Simmons was on injured reserve earlier in the year with a quad injury and is now dealing with a knee injury. Safety Caden Stearns is on injured reserve with a hip injury. Linebacker Randy Gregory had to undergo a knee surgery. Linebacker Baron Browning had to miss time with a hip injury, and cornerback Quan Williams has missed time with a knee injury. Yeah, there are a lot of injuries in Denver. The Denver Broncos fired Vic Fangio after 3 years, and then the Broncos went on and hired supposed offensive mastermind Nathaniel Hackett. The hire made a lot lot of sense. He had a lot of success in Green Bay. That Packers offense was incredible, and Aaron Rodgers won back-to-back MVPs. Hackett coached for 2 decades before he got a head coaching gig, and already had been an offensive coordinator for the Packers, Jaguars, and Bills. But clearly, it just isn't working in Denver. He has had a tough job with the injuries and poor play from Russell Wilson, but the blame has to go on someone, and that scheme is absolutely horrible. I do highly doubt Nathaniel Hackett gets fired during the season at this point. If he were going to, I feel like it would have been after that embarrassing loss to the Panthers, but at this point, I think Hackett at least coaches out the rest of the season. Whether or not he'll be there for the offseason, I don't really know. I personally don't think he should be. There have been some big red flags. He had to hire someone to help with clock management a month into the regular season, and he even gave up play calling duties because it was obvious that what he was doing just wasn't working. Now, you have to give Pete Carroll a lot of credit for the way he handled his quarterback situation. Trading away Russell Wilson seemed like a very bold move. A bad move to most. You don't usually see Super Bowl winning quarterbacks who are future Hall of Famers get traded, but it looks like a great move now. Not only do the Seahawks now have 2 first-round picks and 2 seconds to work with, but Seattle looks like a much better football team than Denver. The Seahawks are 6-5 and fighting for a playoff spot. Geno Smith has been absolutely balling out. He's legitimately been one of the best quarterbacks in the league this season. Geno is cooking. Everything about moving on from Russell Wilson looks like a huge W for the Seattle Seahawks. Something not many people could have said before the season started. Russell Wilson clearly rubbed a lot of teammates in Seattle the wrong way. There's been a lot of shade thrown by current Seahawks players about how it's a full team effort now, and Richard Sherman has talked about his disdain for Wilson on his podcast. Wilson might be a bit of an unlikable guy. His wife Sierra threw a birthday party for him, and it was reported that about half the team attended, and that's something that's really going around on social media right now. I do think you'd expect more teammates to show up, but it was an off day on a Tuesday. I don't think it's much of a story personally, but I do think that Russell Wilson has rubbed a lot of teammates the wrong way. He's rich and famous and just on a different pedestal, but half the team not showing up to his birthday party is just some middle school drama. Although, I bet it was the defense that probably showed up because the offense hasn't shown up all season. I was really excited before this season to watch Russell Wilson play for the Denver Broncos. It seemed like everyone was, and expectations were really high. It's been very disappointing, and the big question is whether or not Russell Wilson will be able to turn it around. The Broncos need him to. They're locked into him with that contract, and there is no going back now. Either the Broncos have made a bad decision that's going to cripple their franchise for the next decade, or Wilson will figure it out. Now, there have been some circumstances that have made this season a lot harder for Russell Wilson. I really wonder how much injuries have been a factor. Is the constant talk of injuries to deflect blame, or is it hindering him? I don't really know. Wilson has had to learn a new offense under a new head coach in a new city. He's had to deal with not just new offensive linemen and new wide receivers, but constant injuries at the positions. Russell Wilson has been disappointing and bad, but there are a lot of reasons for his struggles. Now, the question is whether or not Russell Wilson can figure things out with the Denver Broncos. Do you think Russell Wilson will eventually be good in Denver, or have the Broncos just made a horrible mistake?